Once in Africa, a very heavy flood came after days of strong rain. The water rose higher and higher, flowing into villages, streets, and fields. Houses were broken, trees were uprooted, and animals were carried away by the rushing water. People tried to run for safety, but the flood was so powerful that nothing could stand against it. Roads disappeared under muddy water, and everything looked like a wide, moving river. The narrator, while traveling through the area, found himself passing by an old graveyard. The sight was very strange and frightening. The floodwater had reached the cemetery and destroyed many graves. The ground was washed away, and the graves that had been safe for years were suddenly open and broken. It was as if the flood had uncovered secrets that were hidden deep under the earth. In the dirty, rushing water, the narrator could see human bones floating around. These bones belonged to people who had been buried long ago. The image was shocking because normally a graveyard is a place of peace and respect, but now it was full of scattered remains. However, in another part of the graveyard, the narrator noticed something even more surprising. Some very old graves were still untouched. Inside them, the bodies were safe and looked almost complete, as if they had not been touched by time. This strange difference between broken graves with bones and old graves with safe bodies created a deep feeling of mystery and fear. The memory of this flood and the graveyard remained in the narrator's mind forever. It was not only a natural disaster, but also a moment where the hidden truth of death was suddenly visible, reminding him how powerful nature can be. As the flood spread across the land, the narrator had no choice but to continue his journey. The road he followed led directly past an old graveyard. Normally, this graveyard was a quiet place where no one went except for burials. It was covered with tall grass, broken stones, and some old trees. But on that day, it looked completely different because of the flood. The water had entered the graveyard, turning it into a strange and frightening sight. Graves that once stood in lines were now half buried in muddy water. Some tombstones had fallen down, and others were floating away. The smell of wet earth mixed with something much heavier, something that gave the air a dark feeling. The narrator stopped for a moment, staring at the scene. It felt as though the graveyard was no longer a place of rest, but a place of chaos. The quietness of the dead had been disturbed by the power of the flood. With each step he took, the water splashed around his feet, and the silence of the graveyard seemed to whisper through the air. Passing through, the narrator felt uneasy. The graveyard, already a place of fear for many, now looked like a forgotten battlefield where the dead and the living were brought together by disaster. The flood had not only destroyed homes, but had also invaded the land of those who were supposed to sleep peacefully forever. When the narrator looked more closely, he saw that many graves had been broken by the strong current of the floodwater. The soil around them had washed away, leaving the graves wide open. What was once covered with earth and protected by stone was now exposed to the world. It felt like the flood had torn away the respect and silence that the graves once held. Some graves had completely disappeared, carried off by the rushing water. Others stood half open, their edges weak and crumbling. The flood showed no mercy. It treated the graves the same way it treated houses, trees, and roads. Everything was broken and scattered. The sight of open graves filled the narrator with fear. It was a strange and sorrowful image. These were the final resting places of people who had been buried with care and prayers, but now the water had washed that all away. Instead of peace, there was destruction. Instead of silence, there was the sound of rushing water breaking the ground. The narrator realized how powerful nature could be. Human hands had built graves to protect the dead, but one strong flood was enough to undo all of it. Standing there, he felt a deep sadness. The graves no longer looked like a sacred place. They looked like broken memories washed away by the flood. As the narrator moved deeper into the graveyard, he saw something even more shocking. Human bones were floating in the muddy floodwater. Some bones lay scattered on the ground, while others drifted slowly with the current. Skulls, ribs, and long bones that once formed complete bodies were now separated and spread everywhere. The sight was terrifying. Normally, people never see such things because graves are meant to hide them. But now, because of the flood, the hidden truth of death was out in the open. The water carried the bones from one place to another, as if the dead had been disturbed from their long sleep. The narrator felt his heart beating fast. Fear and sadness mixed inside him. These bones were once part of people who had lived, laughed, and loved. They had families who had buried them with respect, but now their remains were treated like broken wood or stones, moving helplessly in the water. Every splash of the flood seemed to remind the narrator of how weak human life truly is. No matter how carefully graves were made, they could not stand against the force of nature. Watching the bones drifting around, he felt as though the dead were silently crying, asking for peace again. The image stayed in his mind like a nightmare. The flood had not only destroyed land and homes, but it had also uncovered the most sacred secrets of the graveyard. While the narrator was still shocked by the broken graves and floating bones, he noticed something very strange on the other side of the graveyard. There were some very old graves, and unlike the new ones that had been washed away, these old graves were still safe. The water had touched them, but they had not broken. Their stones were strong, and the ground around them was not washed away. Curious and frightened at the same time, the narrator looked closely. Inside one of the old graves, he saw something that made his heart stop for a moment. The body inside was not destroyed. It looked almost complete, as if it had been buried only recently. The clothes were torn and faded, but the form of the body was still there. This discovery shocked the narrator even more than the sight of floating bones. How was it possible that the newer graves had broken so easily, but these older ones still kept their bodies safe? It felt unnatural, almost like a mystery hidden in the ground. The narrator stood silently, unable to move for a while. On one side, the flood had scattered bones everywhere, showing death in its raw form. On the other side, these old graves seemed untouched by time, as if they were protected by something stronger than water. This contrast filled him with questions he could not answer. Was it just the strength of the soil and stones, or was there something mysterious about these graves? Whatever the reason, the sight made the graveyard feel even more eerie and powerful. Standing in the middle of the graveyard, the narrator felt a strange mix of emotions that he could not fully understand. On one side, he saw the horror of broken graves and human bones scattered by the flood. On the other side, he saw old graves that were still safe, holding bodies that looked untouched by time. This difference created a feeling that was both frightening and mysterious. His heart was heavy with fear. Every time he looked at the floating bones, he felt like the dead were watching him, silently asking why their peace had been disturbed. The water made soft splashing sounds, and each sound echoed in his ears like whispers from another world. It was not only nature's power he was witnessing, but also something deeper, something that felt beyond human understanding. At the same time, he felt wonder. How could some bodies remain safe while others turned to bones? It almost felt like a hidden message from the past, a reminder that death is not the same for everyone. The thought made him shiver, as if the graveyard itself was alive, showing him secrets it never wanted anyone to see. The narrator could not decide whether to call it fear, sorrow, or amazement. It was all mixed together, forming one strange feeling that weighed heavily on his mind. He realized that the flood had not only destroyed land and homes, but had also broken the boundary between life and death, making him see what people are never meant to see. Even after the narrator left the graveyard, the images of what he had seen did not leave his mind. The sound of rushing floodwater, the sight of broken graves, the floating bones, and the untouched old bodies all stayed in his memory like a dark picture carved deep inside. Days passed, but he could not forget. At night, when he tried to sleep, the memory returned. He would close his eyes and see the skulls floating in the water, the half-open graves, and the strange bodies that had not turned to dust. It felt like the dead were still calling him, reminding him of that terrible day. The narrator understood that floods destroy houses, fields, and lives, but this time, it had done something more. It had disturbed the peace of the dead and revealed secrets that were never meant to be seen. This thought made him feel very heavy inside, as if he had carried part of that graveyard with him forever. The scene became a lesson for him. He realized how small and powerless humans are in front of nature. No matter how strong walls or graves are built, one strong flood can break them apart. It reminded him that everything in life is temporary, and even in death, nothing is fully safe from the power of the earth. That memory of the flooded graveyard stayed in his heart forever, like a story he could never erase. It was not only a disaster, but also a moment where life and death stood side by side, showing him the hidden truth of the world. We bring you true stories, filled with mystery and fear. That is why we ask you to subscribe to our channel, so you never miss the next story. Thank you for watching our video.